Hi, good evening. I'm Amy Kinsel, Dean of Social Sciences and Library here at Shoreline, and I was Professor of U.S. History before that, so I know the tactics. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Bradley Murg, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Director of the Program in Global Development Studies at Seattle Pacific University. Dr. Murg is also an adjunct faculty member at the Ellison School for Russian, East European, and Asian Studies, Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, University of Washington. His topic is U.S. Russian Relations and New Cold War. So during this 100th anniversary year of the Russian Revolution, U.S. Russian relations are in a somewhat tenuous state. Confrontations in Europe and the Middle East, accusations of Russian meddling in the 2016 U.S. election have strained the bilateral relationship and contributed to unease in Europe, which fears a resurgent Russia. And I have to mention, if you haven't seen it, a recent cover of The Economist magazine that pictured Vladimir Putin as a new czar. So the question for this evening is, what is the state of U.S.-Russia relations? Is this a new or an old Cold War? Dr. Murg's approach to the question of U.S.-Russia relations comes out of a theoretical tradition termed neoclassical realism. It focuses in particular on the structure of global politics, for example, the distribution of military and economic power, and on the domestic politics and economics of each state. Key part of his messages of the past is very much prologue to the present, which, of course, I truly believe as somebody who's taught American history. His research focus is on legal reform, the political economy of foreign aid, and economic development in China and the former Soviet Union. He's a consultant advisor to the Asian Development Bank. There's more in the back. Dr. Murg holds a Master of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics, as well as a Master's and PhD in Political Science from the University of Washington. He's fluent in several languages, including French, Russian, and Mandarin Chinese. And last but not least, Dr. Murg was named the Seattle Pacific University students as the 2017 Professor of the Year. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradley Murg.
All right, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Any night I get to talk about Russia and Russian politics is a happy evening for me. As someone who's in their late 30s, when I started my PhD, I came into the University of Washington. I went to UW partially because it had a very strong program in Russia and China. And throughout my training in my PhD, I was told, well, your career will be mostly about China, so focus on that. Russia's over. No one's going to care about Russia. It's a nice, fun thing you're doing here, but no, don't worry about the Russia side. And lo and behold, it's back. So it's a wonderful day for me to talk about a sad state of political affairs, but for my own personal interest, absolutely fascinating. So our question tonight, fundamentally, is, have we entered a new Cold War? Is this the stage? Where are we likely to see these developments move? And how can we begin to understand them? Essentially, my short answer, not quite. It's not phenomenal, it's not wonderful, but the dynamics and structure of global politics have fundamentally changed since the era of the Cold War. So before we get into the dynamics and the history and how the U.S.-Russian relationship has developed over the course of the last 25 years and how we've gotten to the stage that we are at today, we need to look at some changes in the global political system and the structure of global power that really results in some significant impacts in terms of how this relationship is going to develop. First of all, the big, huge takeaway that we're going to go into a lot of detail a little bit later is the enormous disparity in economic power and power projection capabilities between the United States of America and Russia. Now, when we talk about power projection, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's the ability to basically send your military to other locations and basically project your power. The United States has a remarkable global reach. Russia, conversely, not so much. When we think of Russia today, we really have to think of it not as a global actor so much in terms of its ability to project power or influence other states or become a hegemon across the world, rather as a regional actor. At the same time, Russia has a great deal of domestic political instability. When we talk about the Russian regime today, the type of regime that we see in Russia, we would categorize in political science terms as personalist. This is a regime around one particular leader. It is a regime without anything resembling a coherent ideology. It's a regime that doesn't have a strong party system in any way. This is Putin's Russia, and Putin's the leader. We know these regimes historically tend to be very, very volatile. And we can see, and we're going to look at tonight, how the development of U.S.-Russian relations has to some degree paralleled developments within domestic Russian politics. Finally, if we're talking about the Cold War as a bipolar distribution of power, with two very large states essentially dominating the globe, there is one other state that is rapidly moving up to military equality, economic parity with the United States, and that, of course, is China. If we're going to talk about a bipolar world, that is a divide between the United States and China. However, we need to look at the fact that the relationship between Russia and China is burgeoning in recent years, not out of any great love. And if as someone who's followed the Russia-China relationship for about 15, 20 years now, there we go still. No, it's a marriage of convenience, but it's a marriage of convenience that can have a very significant impact. Both of these states are seeking to shift the global order that we essentially established in the early 1990s, often referred to as the global liberal order. It is also a unipolar order, an order where the United States is overwhelmingly the dominant power in every single sense of the term. China and Russia have consistently said that their goal is a multipolar world, a world where no single state essentially has the ability to influence every other region. And to some degree, they've negotiated division of that, China in East Asia, Russia in the territory of the former Soviet Union. But essentially, it's a marriage of convenience right now. So, with that as a bit of background, we want to start off by going into a bit of the history of the relationship. If we're going to understand where we are today, we need to understand the historical development of U.S.-Russian relations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There we go. All right. So we recognize these two guys, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, and this is the image of the early 1990s, which is fundamentally thought of as a golden era in U.S.-Russian relations. You might recall Francis Fukuyama's famous book, written at the end of the Cold War, The End of History, where Fukuyama argued that it's done. Fascism is over, communism is over, liberal democracy has won. The future of the world is simply going to be liberal democratic states adopting liberal capitalism. That's it. And this was the framing that many people took when they started to look at Russia. Well, Russia will simply naturally develop. It will naturally shift into a good, rule-playing, liberal, democratic economy that participates in the UN and global institutions, and this is where we're going to go and where we're going to move forward. And we look back at it as, it's a period of proto-democratization, of cooperation, of a Russia that's not challenging the United States and seems to basically being a relatively good global citizen. That's our perspective. That's the perspective that we often have in the United States. That is not the perspective that most, or any Russians really, have on this time period, on the 1990s. Rather, this is a period of economic collapse. And if we want to think about the severity of economic collapse in the 1990s, it's useful to do a brief comparison to the Great Depression, or even more recently, the 2008-2009 financial crisis. When we think about economic decline in 2008-2009, we have significant recession for 2 years, negative GDP growth of 2 to 3% in the United States. Everybody went insane. The Great Depression, negative GDP of 25%, quite a lot more severe. The collapse of the Soviet Union resulted immediately, in the next 3 to 4 years, in a collapse in Russian GDP of around 45%. I mean, this is catastrophic for any society whatsoever. At the same time, we begin to see through the process of privatization, the process of state enterprise reform, a system of basically state capture, where you have oligarchs essentially taking control of anything that's of value within the Russian economy, and really fragmenting Russian society enormously. You see massive outmigration of large portions of the Russian middle class to the United States, to Israel, to Western Europe, and other places. You see enormous personal insecurity, poverty, starvation, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, the way to conceptualize this period is less one of a proto-democracy, of a society that is moving through the stages of democratization gradually, but is best conceptualized by the Russian commentator Lilia Shevtsova as fundamentally the beginnings of another form of authoritarianism. That Russia's period under Yeltsin was in no way really a democratic era. It was never going to be committed to democracy. It was simply transitioning from one authoritarian regime to another. A lot of people look at Putin and they think of him as some sort of evil genius pulling the strings behind the scenes and turning Russia from, it's on this wonderful path to liberal democracy and human rights, and then this ex-KGB guy came in who's just a genius and was able to shift it. Not so much. Russia was pretty well on that path in the 1990s. Putin simply consolidated a program that had already been essentially in existence. 1998 is really the absolute bottom for Russian, in terms of Russia's experience in the 1990s. The Russian financial crisis of 1998 We see there just a brief illustration of the change in the relationship between the US dollar and the Russian ruble, shifting from about 5 to 1 US dollar up to about 30 or 35, where it's remained fairly consistently ever since, although it's gotten worse lately. This threw huge numbers of people out of work, closed enormous numbers of businesses, and resulted in massive dissatisfaction with the regime of Boris Yeltsin, who would come out of this basically trying to protect himself. When Yeltsin, by the late 90s, 98, 99, realizes it's time for him to shuffle off the scene, he's looking for a replacement. And the guy he chooses is a bit of a surprise. Vladimir Putin, not a national figure by any means, a provincial figure, a figure in St. Petersburg, essentially a deputy mayor to the reformist mayor Anatoly Sobchak. But Putin had one major thing going for him, one very, very important thing. Sobchak had basically moved on, and Putin had basically taken over significant responsibility in Petersburg. Sobchak, like pretty much every other Russian official in the 1990s, was corrupt. Sobchak was a little bit too corrupt, to the extent that he could easily have been prosecuted. Putin basically made his name, and made his name for Yeltsin, by basically saying, I'm not prosecuting Sobchak. This is the guy that mentored me, this is the guy that basically brought me up through the system. Nothing's going to happen to him. I'm not going to release any evidence, I'm not going to go this way. Yeltsin noticed that. And when Yeltsin was scrounging around for somebody who he could hand power to, who wasn't going to prosecute him, his daughter, his son-in-law, 36-year-old multi-billionaire who controlled Norilsk Nickel, Vladimir Putin had the one key qualification. He knew you don't bite the hand that feeds you. You essentially basically protect the people that you work with and so on and so forth. And this basically got him the job. Thus, on New Year's Eve 1999, Yeltsin resigns, and we have this new guy, Vladimir Putin, coming into power. In the late 90s, though, individuals in the Russian foreign policy establishment began to reevaluate the reality that they had apparently signed up for in the post-Cold War world. And the world they saw, to be balanced in this discussion, was terrifying to them. They saw a situation of, and we can see the map here, of massive NATO expansion. Expansion into Eastern Europe, expansion into the Baltics, and so on and so forth. They saw conflicts in the borderlands of the former Soviet Union, in Tajikistan and in Chechnya. In Chechnya, they'll utilize it quite well. They observed through the financial crisis of 1998 their deep, deep financial dependence on the United States and upon Western Europe. And their first approach to this is realizing that, okay, there's a threat here. There is a severe threat in their perception to long-term Russian security. And ultimately, their first approach to the West in the late 90s is saying, okay, we're not so big on the expansion of NATO. In fact, it terrifies us. In fact, we would really prefer you don't do it in any way whatsoever. Perhaps we could establish a common defense perimeter. With NATO, we'll work together, we'll cooperate, and this will be some sort of positive outcome. At the same time, they approached the European Union and said, okay, we know we're not going to be a member of the EU, but perhaps we could partner on economic modernization. Ultimately, when the responses came to Russia, the response was, okay, cool, but you basically have to accept the structure of how these organizations work. If you're going to do a common defense perimeter, you have to accept that this is fundamentally an American-run show. This is an American-run program. And that was simply a step too far for Moscow. Moscow was not willing to concede that and was not willing to basically take a secondary position. Putin comes to power January 1st, 2000, and it is a simple story of re-centralization of power, where Boris Yeltsin had said to the Russian population and to the Russian political leaders, literally the phrase in English, take as much sovereignty as you can swallow. Basically extending Russian power out from Moscow to the provinces, to business, and so on and so forth. Putin's entire program was to bring that power back to the center, eliminating elections for provincial governor, appointing a federal plenipotentiary to basically keep an eye on every region, limiting the power of governors that were unwilling to basically cooperate with him, several of whom end up in mysterious circumstances no longer being with us. At the same time, we also see the rise of a new group. The group that is most associated with Putin today, the Russian term, siloviki. These are the individuals affiliated with the so-called power ministries in Russia. The Ministry of the Interior, the FSB, i.e. the successor to the KGB, the Russian military, and so on and so forth. This is essentially Putin's initial power base. We recall that Putin, of course, is formerly of the KGB. He wasn't exactly on the varsity team of the KGB. He was on, in the words of General Oleg Gordievsky, the former head of KGB's counterintelligence, he was on sort of the D team. He was posted in East Germany. Now, if you know anything about East Germany during the Cold War, East Germany perfected the totalitarian state, the Stasi. 1 in 5 East Germans was on the payroll of the secret police. The KGB, not really necessary there. He wasn't exactly a high flyer or outstanding performer, but he was among that group, and that is how he fundamentally moved up. And the regime that he would put in place is basically going to be an alliance between himself and various and sundry other branches of the security world. At the same time, Putin is remarkably fortuitous. His timing is perfection. And that comes in, of course, with the question of oil prices. Putin takes office right around the time that oil prices begin to rise after the events of September the 11th, 2001. He has remarkably good luck. The Russian economy is not expanding due to the expansion of small and medium-sized enterprise. It's not receiving remarkably large amounts of foreign direct investment. It's not building up an export economy. It's not reforming industry in a way that they can become competitive with Europe or the United States. No, it's an oil economy. It's an oil and gas economy. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. But the massive influx of funds initially in the natural gas industry from Gazprom, and then subsequently the influx of funds into the oil industry via Rosneft, these are of course the two state-owned or at least state-controlled resource firms, do an enormous amount to basically allow the Russian state to pay back arrears and pensions, to rebuild the educational system, schools, and so on and so forth. And Putin gets the credit for this. Putin basically it's all because of Vladimir. It's not because of this is going on, but anyone else who can look at it basically sees, well, yeah, you got remarkably fortunate here. Very few people can come into office, and so timely, right when you enter office, oil prices begin to go up. Thus, we see economic stabilization. The Russian population views Putin as the guy who basically moved them out of the 1990s, the period of the Wild East, the period of chaos, of insecurity, and so on and so forth. At the same time, Putin gets to reap the benefits of that domestically. He gets to go and basically say to anybody doing business in the 90s, hey, you were doing business in 1994, 95? Did you pay your taxes? Did you follow every single regulation? Of course you didn't. Nobody did. Anybody essentially engaged in large-scale commerce in the 1990s violated the law. It was pretty simple. There was no rule of law in Russia during that time period. Putin utilizes this to consolidate power. He selectively prosecutes those oligarchs who are unwilling to toe in line. He basically has the ability to call out anyone and prosecute on tax fraud or other violations. It's not rule of law, it's rule by law, the particularly selective application of when you're going to prosecute. Yes, one of my favorite photos. It really well encapsulates Putin's initial reaction to some aspects of American foreign policy in the early 2000s, which of course we view as being, hey, pretty logical extensions, pretty positive. So we sort of look at first the expansion of U.S. missile defense to Poland and to the Czech Republic in 2007. A natural expansion as NATO expanded, and a consistent demand by the Polish government, a country that, for very valid historical reasons, has some concerns about its neighbors and its long-term security. At the same time, Putin observes the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and U.S. engagement in Central Asia. The view from Putin's perspective is, remember, he's coming from the old Soviet framework, is this is a major threat. This is not a country that we're going to negotiate with. This is, look at the sheer division in power between the U.S. and Russia. They can do bad things to me. They can cause some severe damage. Putin's perspective is one of essentially that expression. In 2008, Russia essentially invades Georgia. This is widely conceived of as basically a warning shot to the West. It's a region that no one really expects there's going to be a massive Western response to. Georgia has initial ties with the European Union and ties with the United States, but no one expects anyone's going to go to war with Russia over Georgia. Russia invades and basically has strategic reasons for doing so. After the Color Revolution, it saw its military capabilities in that region as being under threat, particularly in the area along the Baltic Sea, the area called Abkhazia, which historically has been a vital power projection point for Russia into the Baltic Sea and thence into the Mediterranean and so on and so forth. The ultimate conclusion of the Russian-Georgian War is pretty unsatisfying for the West, but for Russia it's remarkably satisfying. Today we have Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are frozen conflicts. These are essentially Russian territory. Theoretically independent states. South Ossetia is recognized by two countries, Russia and Nicaragua of all places. They have an embassy in Managua, I've visited. And Russia won. The ultimate conclusion, this territory did not go back to Georgia. Russia managed to basically make its presence known, make its views known, and essentially was signaling to the West, we're not participating in this other stuff, leave us alone, leave our territory alone. Now, when we define Russia and how Russia sees its territory, it's important to know, and the word in English is the near abroad. Russia perceives the entire territory of the former Soviet Union as its sphere of influence and its sphere of influence alone. That any incursion onto that territory is a fundamental threat to Russian security. And this was generally viewed as Russia's way of signaling that loud and clear to pretty much everybody else. You can do what you want beyond the borders of the USSR, but don't come in. We still see that as ours, that is our necessary buffer, and so on and so forth. And we also have to remember, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's not just Russia by itself. Russia creates the Commonwealth of Independent States, a large number of other former Soviet countries locked together in its security alliance. The CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, it tries to institutionalize continued Russian control over security in that region. 2009, beginning of the Obama administration, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton goes to Moscow, meets with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and decides to have the discussion of, we want the famous reset in policy. We want to get away from the Georgia war and the conflict and the issues during the Bush administration. Yes, okay, you might have been concerned, but we're going to do this. It did not go well. You might recall, if you happen to speak Russian, peregruska doesn't mean reset in Russian. Whoever did the translation in the State Department got it wrong. It means overload. And after much humorous discussion between the Foreign Minister and Secretary Clinton, they agreed to do a photo op pressing the button, but it started off and everyone's sort of looking at this as, wow, you couldn't even get the Russian right. Not exactly a solid omen. But there was, at least at this point in time, remember, Vladimir Putin had been term limited essentially out of office, and we have Dmitry Medvedev essentially serving as president while Putin comes into office as prime minister. Medvedev looks pretty good. He seems like a reformer. He seems more moderate. He doesn't have those security links that everybody is worried about with Putin. And he makes rumblings about making Russia a modern Western-style society against Putin's more traditional security focus. This is all for show. This is the Potemkin village fundamentally. And there is no chance that Russia is going to do this. But it makes everybody seem kind of happy for a year and a half. Everyone thinks that this is going to work well, we're going to move forward, but no, absolutely not. There was no possibility of that happening. Medvedev had no real power. Putin's still the one basically running everything, and things begin to cause problems. However, there are some wins. And we have to look at the Obama era and also note those wins in terms of some positive, at least initial aspects in the U.S.-Russia relationship. So there was an uptick. If we view sort of the late Bush years and the Georgia conflict as sort of the beginning of a downward spiral, this is sort of a brief recovery. We have, up until the invasion of Ukraine, the establishment of a U.S.-Russia bilateral presidential commission with 21 working groups working on multiple different issues. We have the establishment of a new strategic arms control treaty, which is still in effect. Russia permits the transit of supplies through its territory, through its airspace, to U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, something that historically it was never really a big fan of doing. Cooperation in Afghan anti-narcotics programming. Russia finally enters the WTO, which for those coming out of sort of a liberal focus was saying, well, this is awesome. Russia's going to be tied into the global economy. Trade will expand. We know when trade expands that there's less possibility of conflict. Maybe this will bring Russia in. Russia's cool with multilateral sanctions on Iran in 2015 and the 2015 Iran agreement, and also with UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea. There are victories. It's not all a negative story during this 8-year period. There are some successes for Russia. But at the end of the day, a series of events are also happening that begins to basically result in Russia becoming significantly more aggressive. Things fall apart. It's really impossible to overstate the importance of UN Security Council Resolution 1973. UN Security Council Resolution 1973 was the Security Council resolution that established a no-fly zone in Libya. Heavily supported, not by the United States initially. The Libya conflict really is pushed by two other countries, by France and by the United Kingdom. who saw it as within Europe's sphere of influence, as a significant threat to European long-term security if the regime continued or if the regime collapsed and wasn't replaced with something. Well, look what happened. But their initial proposal was, well, we have to have a no-fly zone essentially over Libya. Russia and China did not like this. Russia and China take a very traditional view of state sovereignty. So if we go back to the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the founding of the modern interstate system, and states say, okay, you are sovereign over your territory. No one can intervene. No one has the right to intervene within your country under any situation whatsoever. You're the ruler, it's your country, sovereignty is absolute. Resolution 1973 basically said, no, it's not. We can basically intervene, establish a no-fly zone over Libya, and basically make sure that the Libyan Air Force can't go attack rebels. And this is fair enough what the United States and the UK and the British, and the French basically said, here's what we're going to do. And Russia and China, shockingly, agree. They don't vote for the resolution. They just abstain and agree not to veto it. The problem comes, of course, and Russia perceives the subsequent actions as a remarkable violation of trust when the US, France, and Britain become militarily involved in the conflict. And they say, hey, we gave you permission for a no-fly zone. You now are reading this document as an open invitation to intervene in Libya. We didn't support that, and we think once you start intervening with them because of human rights, gee, who might you come after next? Russia and China don't exactly have the most amazing human rights records. At the same time, right around the same time, Russia has yet another election. And there's massive popular protest in Russia for the first time. You begin to see people significantly opposing the Putin regime. And the Putin regime sees this, with no facts to really support it, that the outcome here stems from foreign interference. The Americans are stirring up trouble. The Americans are basically the ones supporting these local NGOs and all of these groups that oppose Putin and the current Kremlin regime. It's them interfering in our politics. Not much data to support that, but that was the perception that basically Russia held. These two events ultimately have a significant impact in terms of Russia's perception of the West. And a few more things are going to affect that as well. Obviously, what comes next, the story of Ukraine. Where is it going, et cetera? Well, before we get into Ukraine, we have to look at some other aspects of Russian domestic politics. We're already into the era now, after the financial crisis, after the drop in oil prices. And the Russian regime has begun to pivot to some degree in terms of its basis of legitimacy. Previously, Putin's basis of legitimacy was, it's not the 90s, I'm not Yeltsin, I'm in shape, I don't drink. Things shifted. His approach, this wasn't working anymore. The economy was slowing significantly. In the late 2000s, early 2000s, you'd go to conferences in Moscow and Petersburg about the next 5 years of the Russian state or the Russian economy, and we all just talked about the same thing. Would oil prices stay above $80 a barrel? Would this price continue, and therefore the Russian state can continue? And by this time, with the global recession, the price of oil begins to drop. And the regime needs a greater source of stability, a greater source of credibility. And it really shifts at this point to the far right in terms of its ideology. It brings in the Russian Orthodox Church as a pillar of its own legitimacy. It takes a much more conservative line on everything from LGBTQ issues to the idea of what democracy is. Putin even comes up with a system. He says, well, I don't believe in liberal democracy. We believe in Russia in sovereign democracy. It's a fundamentally distinct concept. He never really fleshes it out very well, but he says, we know it's something different. Into all of this comes, of course, events in Ukraine. Now, Russia's been significantly worried about Ukraine for quite a while, since the Orange Revolution of 2004. But Yanukovych is in power. He's fine. He's there. He'll keep things under control. But we're still looking at, since the Orange Revolution, we saw new Ukrainian cooperation with NATO. We saw the Ukrainian parliament attempt to eliminate Russian as an official language. We saw Ukraine openly talking about a potential affiliation agreement with the European Union. This is not good. This is not good for Russia. This is Russia's enormous fear. Russia sees Ukraine at many levels as being an integral part of the Slavic world, of an integral part of its security structure, and so on and so forth. For Russia, the sort of least tolerable, but they could live with it situation is what we call the Finlandization of Ukraine. Ukraine becomes basically a neutral border country. Russia's not ecstatic with that option, but they can live with it. In reality, though, Russia sees Ukraine as vital to security cooperation with Russia on the one hand, and second, as part of its new regional economic order. Just as the Europeans have the European Union, Russia attempted to establish the Eurasian Union. This would be a free trade bloc, an economic bloc, including Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, a few other Central Asian states, Armenia. And with Ukraine out, Ukraine's the only one with really any size, any significant economy to speak of. That whole thing becomes pointless. This and basically the revolution in Ukraine that kicks out Yanukovych kills off Russia's plans for a Eurasian Union. Their first plan A, well, let's try to integrate into the global economy, the rest of the world, failed. Now B, well, we're going to build our own little bloc. Well, that failed too because Ukraine's not going to participate anymore. This isn't a track record of remarkably successful foreign policy. And it began to appear that Russia was implementing a revitalized version of the Brezhnev Doctrine, if you remember, fun guy, from the 1960s and 1970s. The idea basically being that the Soviet Union would intervene in states when they made political changes which were not to the Soviet Union's liking, or that they saw as a threat to the Warsaw Pact. And it appeared that what Russia was doing in Ukraine was quite similar. That basically the idea was, okay, Ukraine, you're independent until your independence starts affecting our interests. And we're not going to allow this to happen. Just as Georgia tried to cozy up with the West and started making these little rumblings about joining the European Union, okay, Ukraine, you're doing it too, we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen. Finally, Russia perceives itself, or at least many of its main strategic thinkers perceive itself as, quote, a status quo power. Russia doesn't see itself as we perceive it as a revisionist power, a country seeking to overturn the security consensus of the early 1990s. Rather, it says, hey, we just want to keep hegemony and control over the former Soviet Union. Why do you keep playing in our backyard? Why do you keep coming in and muddling and messing up the waters? This is our area. They see it as a very justifiable position, even though everyone else looks at it and says, well, Ukraine doesn't want to be in your yard anymore. Ukraine really would like to move. The Baltics aren't so pleased either, so no, we kind of have to support these states in their right to self-determination. Thus, we have in 2014, the annexation of Crimea. The 2014 Euromaidan protests and the flight of Yanukovych out of the country. The government in Ukraine shifts, and we add yet another set of conflicts to the pre-existing list of Russian expansion and ultimately establishment of new frozen conflicts. Transnistria, near the border of Moldova, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, as we've talked about, and following the annexation of Crimea, the expansion essentially of rebellion in Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, which will ultimately develop into sort of proto-states that we see today. And this isn't really shifting. This is a remarkably stable equilibrium in terms of the fact that these aren't likely to go anywhere. Just as much as Abkhazia and South Ossetia, still dealing with this frozen conflict many, many years later, we're not really likely to see any shift in these anytime in the near future either, and we'll get into the reasons for that in a moment. Of course, it's also important to note the Crimea and the history of the Crimea as regards Russian perceptions of it. Now remember, this area, up until the 1950s, is part of Russia. In Soviet law, in Soviet maps, this is part of Russian territory. Nikita Khrushchev is the guy that basically says, you know what, we're going to give this area to Ukraine. He was from Ukraine, it was a nice gesture, but the bulk of the population is Russian-speaking. Russia always saw it as sort of, well, Khrushchev did it, he was probably drunk. This is not a great choice, it's really ours anyway. And they trot this argument out. This is historically Russian, this is historically a Russian area, everybody here speaks Russian, they all voted for Yanukovych, absolutely correct. So it's ours, why are you people bothering us about it? And from here, we begin to see a much, much more aggressive Russia. We're going to get into the causality a little bit more as to why the techniques of Russia are the techniques of Russia. But let's take a look. We begin to see violations of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. We see intervention in Syria in support of the Bashar al-Assad regime. This is Russia's last remaining ally in the Middle East. I mean, that's it. Russia and the Soviet Union had enormously deep relationships in this region. This is it for Russia. If Assad goes, that's it for Russia's influence in the Middle East. I mean, Russia really, this is the last area that it has any degree of hegemony. Increased military activity in Europe. For example, we can look at the recent Zapad exercises with Belarus. Zapad, of course, is it's very quietly named, very simply named. It means west in Russian. I mean, you kind of get an idea as to what they're planning or what they're trying to signal here when you name your military operation west. And of course, we see cyber operations targeting the 2016 US election, as well as elections in various countries in Europe. We see support for the European far right. The Front National in France has been heavily funded by the Russian government. There's sufficient evidence now to make that claim without really any doubt, along with significant close relations with the government of Hungary, which has moved further and further away from European Union norms, has been sanctioned by the European Union on a number of occasions, and whose Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, consistently makes positive rumblings about Russia. So what is Russia actually doing? What is its strategy? Its strategy we can simply term the belt of insecurity. It's created a belt of insecurity in its southwestern corner. Abkhazia, Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk, and so on and so forth, really even including Transnistria. Now, this seems like a horrible idea. Why would anyone, if your goal here is to prioritize security and building your own security, why would you want to build a region where there is high levels of insecurity? It seems absolutely insane. Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the broad one is basically to signal to the West, you don't want to get involved here. The second is a policy of deterrence. A policy of deterrence for other former Soviet states. If you decide to go against us, if you decide to ally with the West, this is what will happen to you. It's a pretty strong signal, a pretty clear signal as to Russia's potential response. So how has the US responded? Well, we responded with sanctions. Lots and lots and lots of sanctions. Most recently, the 2017, they're all wonderfully titled too, the Countering Russian Influence in Russia in Eurasia Act, moderately termed. We began with executive orders in 2014 from President Obama, followed by the 2014 Ukraine Freedom Support Act, the 2014 Support for the Sovereignty of Ukraine Act, and previously the 2012 Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. All of these were what we term targeted sanctions, targeting particular individuals who were involved with the death of Sergei Magnitsky, who were involved or can be attributed to supporting or having some degree of investment in or some degree of role in the annexation of Crimea or the conflict in Ukraine itself. And subsequently, these were expanded out to broader economic sanctions against Russia itself. They haven't had an enormous impact. We know sanctions are can sometimes be symbolic, but generally, efficacy, unless they're really targeted absolutely perfectly at groups that support a particular regime, can either backfire or simply have no impact. And in Russia, we haven't really seen them having much of an impact. However, today we get a huge amount of discussion of this is a new Cold War. Now let's go back to the beginning of the talk. This isn't a new Cold War. Russia is not the Soviet Union. Yes, it has an enormous nuclear capability, which we'll get to in a moment. But otherwise, Russia's position is relatively weak. The only place where Russia has a strategic and power projection advantage is in the territory of the former Soviet Union. That's it. This is not a global power. So from here, we can begin to understand what Russia is doing and how Russian strategy basically operates. And so let's look at some new vocabulary here. Cross-domain coercion is the term that really encapsulates what Russia's been doing at present for the last year or so, and what we can really expect in the near future. A country that's weak, a country that is relatively weak, I mean, Russia has a significant military, obviously, but a country that's relatively weak, if you put the US versus Russia in a general conventional warfare conflict, the US wins. The US military is really unparalleled globally, simply the sheer technological advancement of it. So what does Russia do? Well, cross-domain coercion is basically, we have an issue here with this one particular topic. Now, we're not going to fight you. We're not going to have a regular military conflict. But what we're going to do is basically extend this into every domain imaginable. Every possible way we can upset your policy and annoy you, we will do. The goal here, essentially, is what we call coercive gradualism. What you're basically trying to do is wear down your opponent. Across multiple policy areas where they have multiple interests, where they have multiple things that they're trying to do and protect, you try to wear them down. So what do we start seeing? Airspace incursions. We've seen this in Britain, we've seen this in Norway, we've seen this getting very close to American aircraft in many cases. Cyber attacks, which of course we all follow in the press and we know about very consistently, that's caused a huge amount of consternation in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom. Support for the far right in Europe, which has caused abject and total chaos in terms of the question of the future of the European Union. Germany is dealing with the rise of Alternative for Deutschland. Holland's dealing with the rise of Geert Wilders. Hungary basically no longer even has a political party that is not on the right or on the really far right. Poland is now talking about essentially moving in a similar direction. The Front National, Marine Le Pen was second in the election. Russia's been sowing havoc. Russia's been sowing havoc because Russia can. Russia has no alternative. This is the actions of a relatively weak state, but a relatively weak state that's basically seeking to wear down its opponent over time. And it's not a stupid strategy. The most disconcerting part of all of this is Russia's nuclear brinksmanship. Every single Russian military operation, everything that basically Russia has engaged in terms of training exercises for its military over the last 3 years, the scenario ends in the tactical use of nuclear weapons. This is terrifying. This is Russia signaling, we're unpredictable, you don't know what we're going to do. Look, we're openly talking about the idea of using nuclear weapons in Europe if there's a conflict with the United States. No, we're not going to go full out nuclear war, but we are seriously gaming out and training our military in, well, what do we basically do if we use one or two? How does this play out? And no one's quite sure. Russia's doing quite well with its approach of clear and total ambiguity. This is not likely to change. Despite the change in government in the United States, this is Russia's current strategy because it's Russia's only strategy. Russia cannot afford full kinetic warfare with the United States. At the same time, Rex Tillerson here looking very upset, we have the question of, well, what are the challenges for the United States? How does the United States respond? Well, the first question is Russia has been deliberate in a policy of strategic ambiguity. It is not clear how Russia will respond to any particular act. It ends all of its military exercises with tactical nuclear usage, which terrifies everybody. And it seems to say, you do one thing and we're going to jump 4 or 5 steps ahead. Trying to predict Russian behavior in the event of a small conflict is incredibly difficult, and Russia has designed it that way. Second, Moscow has a doctrine, this nuclear doctrine, which we refer to as escalate to de-escalate. They've talked about it very publicly. Again, this is the idea of, okay, let's say the US has sent troops into Ukraine, something along these lines. We're going to use tactical nuclear weapons. And then everybody will come back to the negotiating table because no one else wants to use nuclear weapons and no one wants a gigantic nuclear war. The West will fold. And they have been very blunt about that. Will they actually do it? We don't know. But that's what Russia wants. Third, NATO's not great. NATO has a pretty deep credibility gap in terms of its willingness to act. We have a divide within NATO today. We have Germany and many other countries in the EU constantly talking about we don't need NATO anymore. What we need basically is a European defense force. This isn't what you want to hear when you're confronting Russia. Would NATO respond? Would Germany respond? How is this basically going to move forward? This is a concern. We also see the fact that NATO, realistically, is still pretty much an American-funded, American-run organization. The US spends 4 to 5% of its GDP on defense. Your average European state spends 1 to 2%. The classic example of this, the Libya conflict. When it's France, Britain, and Italy essentially bombing Libya during the Libya conflict, after 6 weeks, they have to call the United States because they'd run out of ammunition. These are not countries that have a really strong power projection capability. NATO is, and is perceived by the Russians to be, weak. And this is something that will have to be resolved. Fourth, for the United States, there's the perception that Russia's already won. Russia's goal? We don't want Ukraine to be part of the EU or NATO. No one's talking about that anymore. We would like some of that territory back, Crimea, Lugansk, and so on and so forth. Well, it's there. It's a fact. Basically, what we've seen is Russia's accomplished, or it can sell to its population in order to basically gain increased nationalism, support for the regime, the rally around the flag effect. Hey, look, we wanted Ukraine not to be part of the EU. We wanted Ukraine not to be part of NATO. We wanted to basically have the West respect us again and basically start listening to what we have to say. Look what we got. Everyone's paying attention to us. And no one's talking about encroaching any further onto our territory. This is a loss for the United States. This could be perceived as a very strong loss for the United States. And one of the challenges of this, just kind of skipping down to the bottom, this is a huge threat to US global credibility. US allies in other countries, particularly when we bring in the question of China here, this becomes very disconcerting. What happens what if South Korea starts looking at this and says, I mean, they said they were going to protect Ukraine. How do we know that they're actually going to do anything for us? Maybe it's time to make a deal with China. Japan, the same thing. This is a serious global threat to US credibility. if that perception, if Russia keeps basically gaining. Next point, the U.S. has relatively limited leverage. The sanctions were implemented because people thought the sanctions would work. Everyone 4 or 5 years ago was looking at this and saying, the oil price is down, the Russian economy is not growing anymore, put the sanctions on, it'll just kill it off. It'll be the death knell of the Russian economy, it will collapse, and so on and so forth. I thought that too. I was incorrect, like everybody else. I fully admit it. I underestimated, if you ever read Dr. Zhivago or saw the movie, the famous Pasternak quote saying, well, damn our Russian capacity for suffering. And everyone thought that this would be it, that this would basically finally wipe out Russia. It hasn't. What we've seen, in fact, is that Putin's popularity has actually gone up. This was not intended. Finally, well, what's the U.S.'s other option? Well, we could arm Ukraine. Simply continue the war, arm Ukraine. Ukraine can go in and basically try to take back its old territory. Well, nobody wants that. That's a proxy war. That turns into a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia by other means, which of course means the eventual entry of one side or another. And then of course you have to come to the question of, will Russia use tactical nuclear weapons? Terrifying. Just 2 more and then we're done. Some other stuff, so broadly we can anticipate this is the challenges the United States is going to face. And this is what we can expect for the foreseeable future. We're not likely to see any change. We're not going to see escalation because Russia doesn't have the capacity to do so. We're not going to see de-escalation because this is working for Russia. This is what we can expect in the short to medium term in U.S.-Russia relations. Other stuff. We will see a closer Russo-China relationship. It is in China's interest. China has spent billions of dollars on what's called the New Silk Road project, the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the personal favorite project of this guy, Xi Jinping, the president of China, who President Trump just met with recently. And Russia's vital to that. Russia, as the land bridge to Europe, is vital to China's long-term economic interests. Also for China's security interests. Remember, if you look at China's security interests from the perspective of Beijing, it looks out onto East and Southeast Asia, and what does it see? South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines. All of these countries are very close American allies. In the event of a U.S. conflict with China, the U.S. strategy is pretty simple. Blockade China. Don't let a single ship in. Don't let anything in at all. China knows this. What's China's only alternative? Build connections through Russia. Build pipelines, build roads, build trains. Russia is, and as somebody who's half Canadian, is the Canada to the United States. It is a huge resource supplier. It is the back door, the entry that can basically keep China going in a military conflict. They have a very strong basis for future relations. At the same time, we're likely to see these states, possibly not Hungary, the Baltic states and the Visegrad 4 countries, really balancing much more intensely with the United States. We're starting to see this in Europe in a number of contexts. When Sweden starts making noises about joining NATO, when various other countries in Eastern Europe basically start talking about, when Finland starts talking about joining NATO, we start seeing the situation has changed. When Lithuania starts building an actual wall along its border, things are shifting. There is serious fear in Eastern Europe and in the Baltics and in Scandinavia today as to where Russia is going with this and to the security of these states. And for now, people are flocking to the United States despite the lack of popularity of the US president in Europe. So what are our next steps? It's not going to be anything dramatic. It's not going to be anything hugely glamorous. Rather, the first thing, the single most important thing that has to happen in the near future is increased military-to-military cooperation between the US and Russia. Why? All of Russia's little tactics, the flyovers, the closeness in terms of, oh, well, we're going to put our military here while you're doing your operations, that easily results in miscalculation. People are human. People make mistakes. No one wants to be in a situation where one of those incursions into airspace results in somebody shooting down a Russian plane and then World War III begins. Because it could. The Russians have been ambiguous about it. The Secretary of Defense Mattis has referenced this and really needs to become much more in the picture in terms of building up this relationship, just as a preventative measure. Remember, the Cold War was brilliant in the sense of preserving security, precisely because there were clear boundaries. There were clear lines of where you could go and where you couldn't go. And if you crossed those boundaries, that would cause a conflict. No one's quite sure where the boundaries are here right now. Russia makes statements all the time saying, well, this is, you put 3,000 soldiers into Poland. That's a threat to us. No, it's not. You have 300,000 soldiers just across the border. No one thinks that this is actually a threat to you. But Russia's signaling it's a threat, so how might they respond? We don't know. The ambiguity and the confusion of the lines where Russia sees its interest are causing huge problems, and preventing a global conflict should be the first thing on the table. Second, much closer work with the European Union, particularly Germany, to keep sanctions pressure on Russia. We've already put them in, we might as well keep them there. Russia can't hold out forever. Its economy does have severe problems. Its budget has severe problems. It's run through most of its rainy day fund. It hasn't invested in Rosneft or Gazprom. It needs new technology. The Russian economy isn't going to fix itself. To some degree, the US can wait it out. Russia will eventually have to make some significant economic reforms. 3, perhaps launch strategic stability talks, the extension of the new arms reduction treaty, and so on and so forth, simply as a way to begin to move forward, as a way to possibly build new confidence measures, and also let's start more serious discussions about the nuclear issue. Finally, it's fundamentally vital that the US begin to close the credibility gap with NATO. To some degree, we're seeing much less recalcitrance by NATO member states in terms of upping their defense budgets and becoming more serious about this. If you've looked at the history of NATO is essentially the US coming in saying, for the love of God, spend more money on defense. Now, we have European countries saying, we're going to spend more money on defense. Happy to do it, no problem. That's a big shift. But it needs to be nudged forward, and the current state of US-EU relations isn't exactly wonderful. Brexit has not helped, and Euroscepticism has not helped in Europe in general. So we're not at the best stage for NATO or for the European Union. This is what we're likely to see. This is where things are likely to move forward. And with that, sorry I went a little bit long, but as you can tell, I love this topic. And I'll just open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
So I don't know if this is particularly non sequitur or not, but I'm not going to pass on the opportunity to ask a political scientist to discuss the differences between authoritarian and libertarian and collectivist and individualist axes and how they apply to how we define the terms left and right politically. Because there's a lot of, there's no clear answer out there.
The term, we'll also kind of throw in a little bit about Russia here. So if we're basically talking about, authoritarianism and what we mean by authoritarianism, the easiest way to grasp it is sort of a via negativa approach. And we oftentimes think of, authoritarianism is simply not democracy. It's not just democracy, it's not liberal democracy. But there's myriad variants of authoritarianism. When we think of the pure typical authoritarian state, the country that we're thinking about is China. There is no space for political contestation. There is no freedom of speech. There is no freedom of assembly. There is no free press. China is the perfect authoritarian state. Russia, not so much. Russia is moving in that direction, but Russia we've historically sort of classified as a proto-authoritarian state during the Yeltsin era. And what Putin did, according to two really brilliant scholars of regime type, Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Wei, shifted Russia to what we call a competitive authoritarian regime, in the sense that Russia allows small places where you basically can engage in politics. There is some independent media in Russia. There's stations like Echo Moskvy, wonderful radio station, I'm a huge fan. There's Dozhd, there's Novaya Gazeta. There are places where there are people who are free to criticize the regime, up to a point. There is the Duma, where there are people in the opposition who can basically raise points under parliamentary privilege. There is the court system, which occasionally might give some sort of ruling to them, and so on and so forth. And there are elections. We have Alexei Navalny running for president of Russia. Russia is a competitive authoritarian state in that sense. Now, if we sort of shift to the way other side, in political science, we don't look at much as sort of the question of libertarianism, except in political theory, and I'm not a political theorist. I'm a very, very dull comparative political economist, much less exciting. But we would look at it sort of as being more the idea of liberalism, essentially the idea of the protection of individual rights and so on and so forth. You can, of course, contrast libertarianism with authoritarianism. If we talk about libertarianism in terms of the political thought of Nozick and so on and so forth, or even liberalism of John Rawls, then we can think of it as basically saying, well, yes, this is the libertarian definition would be very simply the idea of the protection of rights above all else. That we wouldn't take a consequentialist approach to a particular question. So where someone might say, oh, well, you have to look at the outcome. You have to look at the outcome here, and if you have to violate a right to get that outcome, that's cool. A pure libertarian would basically say, no, you never violate the rights. Rights are sacrosanct, and so on and so forth. In terms of our perception of Russia along these lines, or sort of how we can relate them, liberalism in Russia is dead. I mean, this is one of the terrifying things about contemporary Russia. Everyone looks at Russia and says, oh, if only that awful Mr. Putin would go, everything will become sweetness and light. Not true. What's behind Putin is a heck of a lot scarier. Putin, at least to some degree, is a pragmatist who knows the game. Russia has an enormous far right that basically is there and is much less au fait with global affairs than they probably should be. But liberalism in Russia essentially has a really tragic history. In the 1990s, when we had the Big Bang economic reforms, we saw essentially the cohort of Russian liberals, people like Anatoly Chubais and so on and so forth, basically be the ones doing a lot of the economic reform, and it failed. It was a horribly structured system that simply didn't work. The Chinese model of gradualism was much more successful. In Russia, we saw essentially this era of abject economic chaos. The Russian population still essentially blames on that group. The subsequent Liberal Party, which in the last election, or the election previous to this one, was finally kicked out of the Duma because it didn't reach the 5% threshold for seats, Yabloko, means apple, went. They were never getting support. They weren't getting support in that sense whatsoever. People basically said, nope, you guys are the 90s. We don't want to go back to that. That's what liberalism is. That's what your approach is. So in Russia, we don't really see any perspective, any real support for that on any particular level. At the same time, those who do support it, the urban educated middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg, one of the great challenges for Russia is those folks leave. They move out. A survey of Russians under the age of 30 showed 60% wanted to immigrate. The higher level, the number goes up, the more educated you are. These are the folks who are likely to make a stink. These are the folks who are likely to protest and say enough is enough is enough. But these are also the folks who are looking for the exits. The folks basically applying to move to Western Europe, the US, Israel, and so on and so forth. Oh, sorry, he's got to get the microphone. I remembered.
I'm curious about your views on sanctions. And somewhere in the middle, you said they didn't work, and something like that. And then in your conclusion, you acknowledge that we have them and we ought to hang in there. When we were in Russia this summer, compared to a previous trip, sanctions clearly are having an impact on the local people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's stuff you can't get that we could get before.
Yeah.
And, you know, I suppose it depends on your perspective, but, you know, it is working to some degree in some places, for sure. And, you know, Russia isn't a country that particularly can feed itself, so that seems to be where stuff is happening.
The ban on Western food imports.
Particularly, yeah, I mean, from, you know, Western Europe.
Yep, the cheese thing
stuff
too,
like
yep.
that. Yeah, actually helps some people smuggle in some Parmesan.
Good man.
But yeah.
How does it work out? So in my view, if we look at sanctions, when we look at the question of sanctions and the challenge of sanctions, sanctions can work. Sanctions that are targeted work very well. If they're targeted towards the right groups. If you target towards a group that basically is the power base of a personalist regime, personalist regimes like Putin's have a very narrow support base. And once their supporters, their clients, stop getting payoffs, they basically say, enough, we're not on your team anymore, we're happy to see somebody else take over, your support base crumbles. The sanctions that we've implemented, although legally many of them are designed to basically impact that group, just haven't had that effect. They need to be recalibrated and they need to be retargeted towards that particular group. The problem with large-scale sanctions, the agriculture and so on and so forth, and the sort of tit for tat between the two, is we can look at sort of the Cuba scenario. You will cause economic hardship. But the regime oftentimes can get brand new populist support by saying, look what the horrible Americans are doing to us. You can blame every economic problem on the sanctions. And the concern is that that's what we've seen in the short term with the sort of broader sanctions in Russia, is that folks have basically, Putin has been able to revivify his support by no one saying, well, of course the economy is rubbish. There's been, the oil and gas price is low. You haven't invested in any of this. You've killed off small and medium-sized enterprises. This has been a horrific economic policy that depicts massive corruption and incompetence on the part of the Russian government. But now, Vladimir Vladimirovich can come in and say, it's all those nasty Americans' fault. Look what they're doing to you. It's not me. And this is, we've seen in the political economy literature, in the public choice theory literature, we've seen this shown sort of over and over again. So I think we do need sanctions, but we need to basically take a step back, look what works, and then coordinate with the EU to come up with a better set of targets. I think gentleman in the front also is, I accidentally, yeah, perfect.
Hey, I lived for almost 2.5 years over in eastern Russia. I worked in the oil fields there, helping build the pipelines, helping, we got one well to get 11,000 barrels a day. And I married a Russian woman and I really like the Russian people. What's it going to take to warm relations with the Russians and normalize them?
It's not going to be soon. It's not going to be soon in any time. So, I mean, when we're looking at, so perceptions of the United States and Russia among Russians, so the Levada Center does excellent polling. It's one of my favorite organizations, NGOs in Moscow. They do the best research in terms of Russian attitudes towards the West. And they're getting worse. They're getting consistently worse. We are not popular. Our culture is not popular. Anything about us is basically gone. We were never awesomely popular, but things were better at previous eras. Ultimately, it's a question of, okay, is the U.S. going to be able to use its normal soft power diplomacy? Is it going to be able to, do we have any leverage? And the thing is, we just don't at this point in time. There's not much that we really can push, particularly also because we have the situation where the Kremlin has really framed the question pretty clearly. One of Putin's first things when he took over power in the early 2000s, the two guys who controlled Russian media, the bulk of it, a guy by the name of Vladimir Gusinsky, another guy by the name of Boris Berezovsky, said, okay, Putin, good for you, we're still getting involved in politics. Ho, ho, ho. They lasted about 6 months. Berezovsky fled to London, Gusinsky fled to Israel, their companies were taken over by the state, Russia controls media. They have done a remarkably successful job of basically framing particular questions to the population. As well, this is how the U.S. is, and so on and so forth. Their propaganda is, and one of the most fascinating things we're seeing now is we're seeing propaganda moves that are really straight out of the old Soviet playbook. It's not new stuff. It's sort of like you're dusting off your old notes from the 1980s, and oh, they did this before. In my view, we just don't have any real basis on which to move forward in terms of shifting the population's perception of the United States. Unless you had a political entrepreneur in Russia, I don't think Alexei Navalny, the opposition candidate, is probably the guy. But unless you had a political entrepreneur that could really harness some sort of popular dissatisfaction or create an alternative. So a good way to think about this is, a few years ago, there was the famous punk band in Moscow, Pussy Riot, that did the huge show it was only about 30 seconds, in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. Big mistake. I mean, everyone's, how sad what they're being. This was, for Putin, this was a gift. This was the event they were waiting for. You have defiled the cathedral of the Orthodox Church. The patriarch's going to come out. Every Russian Orthodox priest is going to trot out and say, what are you doing? And Putin is going to step in as the savior of Russian values, of Russian tradition, of the Russian faith. It was a gift. They were waiting for something like this to happen. And at this point, he completely reframed his regime. His regime basically became, we are the defenders of Russian civilization. In the historical debate in Russia between do you become Western or are you a Slavophile and stay Russia is distinct, Russia is Eurasian, Putin staked out his territory. We're not Western. We may have flirted with it. Medvedev may have said a few things about becoming more along those lines, but no, we are different. We are Russian. It's a different civilization, and the only person out here to protect it is Putin. Do you want to go back to the 90s? Do you want to go back to a band defiling this holy church in Moscow? And for the near future, he's got it. Oh, go quick, yeah. Oh, sorry, she's got to bring the mic.
You were talking about these flight incursions, and what really popped into my mind is how come Putin didn't take out Erdogan when he shot his jet out of the sky over Syria? That to me seemed like a golden opportunity for Putin to really push.
It's an open question. There's a very strong possibility it's simply it's strategic. It's weakness on the part of the Russian military. There was an image here that I didn't actually have a chance. I skipped over, which I shouldn't have done, which is pretty useful for understanding the contemporary Russian military. Sorry, I think it's one more, or two, or three, or four. There it is. Okay, anybody might recognize this. This is the Russian aircraft carrier Kuznetsov. This is from the Russian Baltic Fleet. It was basically going down through the English Channel, through the Mediterranean to go support the Russian military in the Mediterranean. It's a piece of junk. It has to go with a tugboat because it breaks down so often. You're not supposed to have that much black smoke. Russia doesn't have serious power projection capability, essentially. It has a significant degree of weakness. So on some level, it could simply be a question of they don't have the capability to do it, and so on and so forth. They by far do not have the technology that's equivalent to other countries.
I believe that Russians like strong leaders. what do you see happening after Putin? And are there any people that you think might fill the place?
Might come forward. It's an interesting question. So this is sort of in the study of Russian history is the idea of the vozhd, that Russians that Russians like strong leaders. And there's a whole school of historiography of Russian history back in the day that looked at it and said, well, this is because of the Mongols. It's because of the occupation of the Mongols. It's Chinggis Khan and the Golden Horde, and they occupy Russia. And from there on out, we get these very strong leaders, whether it's Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and so on, and up to Stalin. I'm not a big believer in the theory. As a political scientist, I have a lot less. I'm not a big fan of sort of norms that continue over centuries that I can't trace. I always find it weird. It's just sort of, okay, well, what are the feedback mechanisms for this? How does this work? However, my view in terms of the future of Russian political development is it's not becoming democratic anytime soon. It is likely to remain authoritarian. That being said, after Putin goes, it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be a mess. There is no clear successor. There is no individual. I mean, the really horrifically dangerous thing about personalist regimes like this is you don't have a successor right by you. Why? Because that person can take you out. You generally also surround yourself with people who aren't exactly the sharpest knives in the drawer, because you don't want someone who can scheme to move you out. Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, if we've all been following the news, just experienced this. The guy he had below him was a little bit too sharp, and Mugabe had gotten a little bit too old, and now he's basically gone. Putin, there's no clear successor. We know it's most likely that it would come from from the Siloviki. It would come from one of the power ministries or from the military, somewhere along those lines. But we see significant shifts in terms of basically who's up and who's down. The foreign minister is one of the few people who's been around consistently, but he really doesn't have the power base to go about doing it. At the same time, no one's entirely certain what the full extent of Putin's relationship with the various oligarchs in Russia is. One of the arguments is sort of a hub and spoke system. He basically mediates. He mediates and he profits and so on and so forth. But these individuals have billions and billions of dollars and can seriously impact Russia if he's gone. So it's a completely open question as to who comes next. The only thing we know is, we're talking a desire for stability. Putin's sort of the devil you know. The devil you don't know, it could get even scarier.
Hi. So you talked about the rise of far-right parties in Europe and Europe. So the approximate cause is they've been partially explained by migration of refugees and migrant crisis. So do you think Russia simply took advantage of it, or do you think Russia supporting far-right parties is a strategic play by Russia that would have happened anyway?
So if we look at the rise of the far right in Western and Eastern Europe today, this is something that was not predicted. This is something that most people didn't see. The best scholar of this is a guy at the University of Georgia by the name of Cas Muda from the Netherlands originally. He is the guy on far right politics. And there's a few variables that have led to this. We can see that there has been some significant dissatisfaction with the European Union. We can, among a large segment of the European population. We can see that there has been rising inequality. We can see the fact that there's been wage stagnation in many places. People haven't had a raise in quite a lengthy period of time. And there's a growing economic gap. The greatest example sort of is Britain itself, where we see, the north of England deeply stagnating, whereas the southeast becomes wealthier and wealthier. And you think Seattle house prices are bad. Much worse. Russia basically, much like a lot of Putin, Russia got very lucky. In the sense that the migrant crisis was, as you say, absolutely correct, the precipitate cause of this. And Russia was able to basically fuel, financially and otherwise, far-right parties that were sitting there waiting to basically take advantage of it, like the Front National and Marine Le Pen and Alternative for Deutschland and so on and so forth. So Russia got lucky. Essentially, the migrant crisis provided the basis for these parties to basically gain popular support and become much more frank about what they believe, and also to really terrifyingly find a place in the regular political spectrum. The AfD in Germany is now in the Bundestag. This has shifted. Russia basically, just that whole idea of Russia's going to apply its strategy everywhere. Anything that falls into Russia's lap, it's going to use. You can kind of think of it as you're stranded on a desert island, you find any possible tool. That's what Russia's doing. Any advantage that it can basically redeploy, any disadvantage to its opponent that it can redeploy to its advantage, that's what it's going to do, and it's going to keep doing it.
Do you think the election of Trump is going to change anything? Like, for example, like you don't see Congress and Senate like supporting any measures, like with any supporting any measures or feeding ground with Russia or like working with Russia, but Trump might be like persuaded to do that. So do you see any change?
It's a great question, and this is one of the points where in my classes I normally get to say I don't study the United States, which in this political climate is an awesome thing to be able to say. Everyone's on eggshells these days. But no, from what we've seen, the Trump administration, as we all know, is incredibly difficult to predict. If we're looking though at, Secretary Tillerson has been very consistent in terms of his position towards Russia and what he sees as basically U.S. policy towards Russia, which is pretty much stuff that I've outlined in the lines of military-to-military cooperation and pushing back in certain areas, in cooperating with the European Union and so on and so on and so forth. And General Mattis, Secretary of Defense, along with the Joint Chiefs, essentially the pros have pretty much consistently said we're going to continue to take something of a hard line in Russia. Now, of course, that can be completely changed under our system. The president could fire Secretary Tillerson. The president could make a fundamental shift. And I don't think anybody really knows how Trump makes decisions. Is it just I woke up this morning and I don't like Rex and he's gone? Or Putin said something that was vaguely flattering to me yesterday, I think we're going to be nicer to Russia. I have no clue. I'm just as ill-informed as everybody else in terms of trying to sort of do Kremlinology and figure out, okay, what is this man thinking at this point in time? My view generally, though, as a political economist, as someone who looks at this stuff, is I was probably one of the few people when Trump was elected that I was actually relatively calm compared to the rest of my Facebook and Twitter feeds. And when I saw it, I was like, well, institutions are hard to change. Institutions, we know, are very, very sticky. It's very difficult. The president has a huge amount of agency, but there's a lot of institutions that structure the decisions that he can fundamentally make. There is the military, there is the Department of Defense, there is the State Department, so on and so forth. The ship of state is very hard to turn. And although he has 4 years to do it, and he can make some significant policy changes, I'm still one of those folks who basically believes it's really difficult to reform institutions. It's really difficult to basically deploy a bureaucracy that's fundamentally opposed to you. Along certain lines. They're going to drag their feet, they're going to quit, and so on and so forth. The Trump administration has had severe challenges filling a lot of these assistant secretary, undersecretary positions in the State Department and in other places. We're a year in, and we're missing an entire level of bureaucracy. I was talking to a colleague at one of the American embassies overseas a few months ago, and he was basically saying, I was saying, well, what are you guys doing about this? He's like, we were waiting on DC. Like, well, what's the policy on? We don't know. We have no clue. We're just kind of in a holding pattern. But no one's told us this. The person in that office quit or resigned or got fired, and they haven't replaced them yet. So I think to some degree it's difficult to make a big shift. It's difficult to make a big shift against those institutions. It's also very difficult for someone who's a political genius to basically master bureaucratic infighting. So that might not happen for Mr. Trump. It's hard enough for someone who's really good at it, who knows the ins and outs of government to do. I don't think he's has that ability necessarily. So I still sleep probably more soundly than a lot of people. And yep, well.
It is somewhat ancillary to your topic, but you see Poland, and Poland isn't having a great relationship with the European Union,
yeah.
And historically it isn't going to go to Russia. So do you see Poland being isolated, or where are they going to go, align themselves with?
We all saw the big march a few days ago, the sort of 60,000 people marching in the street, not exactly the most positive images coming out of Poland these days, and we've seen the sort of ruling party in Poland continue with a nationalist rhetoric, or a rhetoric on rule of law, on human rights, on protections for minorities, on migrants, on refugees, and so on and so forth, that has been pretty antithetical to what the European Union has to say. If this were classic European Union, where things were still the usual Franco-German leadership and everything was moving along the line nicely, then I would agree. I would say that Poland is rolling the dice here in not the best way. But the European Union right now is incredibly fragile. We do have Angela Merkel and we have Emmanuel Macron, the new French president, seeking to revivify the sort of Franco-German engine of the European Union. But there's some problems. The European Union can't seem to get through 6 months without a brand new crisis. And where you might basically say, okay, we've resolved this, now we can talk about Poland. Well, Poland's pretty far down on the list. There obviously are issues and they have to be dealt with, but Hungary's a much bigger concern. And as of the last month and a half or so, we now have to deal with the crisis in Catalonia and the possibility of secession there. And of course, no one has any clue how Brexit's going to end up. Everyone says, is there going to be a deal? Is there not going to be a deal? Who knows? It's still basically open season. Poland, unfortunately, a lot like Hungary, can kind of slip through the cracks. Also, there's the question of, do you really want to isolate Poland? Do you want to get Poland angry? I mean, Poland is not going to ally with Russia. That's highly doubtful. But do you want a situation where Poland is not going to be the happiest supportive member of the EU? In this security situation, probably not. It's probably a path too far. So I think Poland, one of the reasons that we're seeing what's going on there is the fact that the Polish government knows this. They know that they can start making some more outrageous statements and so on and so forth, and they're not going to be sanctioned. So it's the causality sort of comes from both directions.
I just had a quick question on where you were characterizing, general impression of Americans as being negative and probably getting worse in Russia. I run a bilateral forum that's between specifically West Coast and Russian Far East, the Russian-American Pacific Partnership, and we've been doing that for 22 years and have continued to do it even through since 2014 and on, although with some difficulty in terms of U.S. government participation. Yeah. Luckily, we're a non-government organization, so we can keep that going. But I was wondering what you see in terms of the subnational relations, say regions to states. We just had Jerry Brown over in Vladivostok at the Eastern Economic Forum. And I'm just wondering what you see in terms of the opportunity for particularly Pacific Northwest, Alaska, working with regions in the Russian Far East?
I think you're going to see, I think it's a great question because I lived in Vladivostok myself. I'm a huge fan of the region, and it's different. I mean, you do obviously have the sort of standard, Russia is standardized to some degree, and I mean, across all of the time zones. There is going to be sort of anti-American sentiment. In fact, Vladivostok was the place I first lived in Russia. That was the only place I was ever really, on occasion, at a restaurant kind of worried because it was a previously closed city and so on and so forth, but it's obviously reformed. Today in the Russian Far East, of course, we have to look back, particularly in Primorsky Krai and Khabarovsk. Their concern historically has not been the United States. Their concern historically has been China. We saw this with the previous governor of Khabarovsk Krai, with Khabarovsk province, with Primorsky Krai. We've seen huge amounts, in Khabarovsk in particular, of very anti-Chinese sentiment. And we do see significant anti-Chinese sentiment really throughout the region. The concern being, which has been expressed in the popular media in the Russian Far East for 15 to 20 years and seems to just be sticking and holding, is the concern of Russia has a declining population. It has a declining relative capacity to China. And the fear is that China will come back and China will basically take that territory. Because let's be frank, it was Chinese before the Treaty of Nerchinsk. And this view, I think there are opportunities basically at that lower level because the primary geopolitical concern in the Russian Far East isn't the United States, it's China. So you, I think, can get local and provincial level cooperation there in terms of at that level by basically recognizing that, well, they're not focused on Europe, they're not focused on the West, they're focused on this. At the same time, there will obviously be limits in terms because of what the Russian federal government can do in terms of basically blocking anything along those lines that goes too far, that it sees as threatening its relationship. And Russia's probably going to try to tamp down some of the anti-China stuff. It won't have any impact. Those views are pretty set in stone in that part of the world right now. But there are definite opportunities. The U.S. isn't a threat to the Russian Far East. And to be frank, the U.S. has a constructive role to play in that region. Russia has a constructive role because of the previous six-party talks, the North Korea question. Nobody wants that situation to basically get under control. There are strong incentives for cooperation in the region, and the populace's generally anti-China perspective kind of blunts the anti-American stuff. The enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of strategy. So, yep.
Yeah, I would just mention that Russian federal government actually has been very supportive of our forum continuing. So even when the U.S. government in 2014 did basically a boycott of sending government personnel to the meeting, Russian government came to a U.S.-hosted meeting that year, in full force, and every year has been supportive of the forum continuing. So they're actually very encouraging, seemingly, of U.S. Involvement in the Russian Far East, probably because they need the help there.
And they need the investment. Yeah. And you're going to get, and remember the main, if we look at sort of Primorsky, if we look at Vladivostok in particular, I mean, who's our main investor? It's South Korea. I mean, you go to Vladivostok, I mean, Korea, everything's about Korea. And of course, Korea is a very close American ally and so on and so forth. But anything to build up that region, any investment from that region, of course, always feels let down by Moscow. They always feel isolated. They always feel that they're not getting their due. And so there is going to be, a little bit more independent action.
Brad?
Yeah.
Can you speak for a little bit about a Chinese worldview in comparison to Russian?
So China's perspective is, we can actually think of it as having some degree of parallels. So when we look at Beijing's perspective, just as sort of I talked about, as Russia sees itself as being sort of threatened by encroachment into its world, China sees a very similar approach. In the sense of the United States basically expanding and looking out from its territory and seeing the constant threat of the U.S. military. And if you're China, you look at South Korea, you see 26,500 American troops. You look at Japan, you see American military bases in Okinawa. You look at Taiwan, you see the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. If China attacks Taiwan, the U.S. is legally obligated to come to the defense of Taiwan, which means, of course, World War III. At the same time, we sell weapons to Taiwan every year. Duterte can say what he wants in the Philippines about, oh, we're going to become China's ally. Everyone knows that's not going to happen. The Filipino military is incredibly linked to the United States. The Philippines has a huge diaspora in this country. The U.S. position is very strong there. China, though, openly admits that it's a revanchist power. It is seeking change in the global system. After Tiananmen Square in 1989, the Chinese government essentially faced an enormous credibility gap. The economy had slowed, reforms had slowed, and they introduced something called the Patriotic Education Campaign. The Chinese government reframed its legitimacy away from just economic growth to, we are the saviors of China. We are the voice of pure Chinese nationalism. In 1949, look what we did. We reunified China completely. And the slogan they came up with, which you can still see on banners throughout China, never forget national humiliation. The 1800s, really through the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. And this has worked wonders for the government of China. Just as Russia is deploying state-led pragmatic nationalism in order to basically gain support, so is China. China, however, has ended up in a very dangerous situation where this nationalism has become so intense that it's tied the Chinese government's hands. They cannot be perceived by the population as doing anything that is not the classic nationalist move. They do not want to see an opposition or any other faction coming up and saying, hey, they don't really support Chinese nationalism, we do. Which means China can't be seen to back down on certain things. It can't basically give up on the Diaoyu Islands. It can't give up on the Taiwan issue. It is locked in to some degree. At the same time, China and Russia share the goal of a multipolar world. Their common enemy is U.S. unipolarity and U.S. control over the region and over their region. China sees itself, justifiably, as the natural hegemonic power of East Asia. Why? Because it was, from the beginning of history until roughly the First and Second Opium Wars in the early 1800s. That was China's role. China sees itself saying, this is our natural position. This is where we're coming back to. But unlike Russia, is pretty frank about it. And of course, when you have 12% GDP growth and you've lifted more people out of poverty at a faster rate than any other country in the history of the world and engaged in a massive program of military modernization, you kind of have the cred to say it because no one's going to dispute you. So for me, though, the relationship between the two is a marriage of convenience. If it's not practical, both sides will basically give it up. But it's not one with deep trust. It's not one with deep trust in any ways. Just as we saw sort of the Russia's concern in the Russian Far East, this is a problem for the long-term relationship. But for now, it's workable, and they are cooperating in certain areas, expanding use of the Chinese currency over the US dollar, partnerships in terms of oil and gas and energy, and so on and so forth. But we also see areas of conflict. China has basically moved into Central Asia and really has become the dominant power. Russia and China pretend, essentially, that there is this agreement that Central Asia will always be a Russian sphere of influence. Everyone knows that's over. Kazakhstan in particular, we've seen, is increasingly under an incredible amount of Chinese economic control. Central Asia is an entry point into China, and China has, and will continue to do under the One Belt, One Road initiative, what it's been doing for the last 5 or 10 years, but even more so. The thing to note on Chinese foreign policy on the Belt and Road initiative is this is Xi Jinping's big project. This is his legacy project, and the Chinese government just changed. In what we call in China the Shizhou Da, the 19th Party Congress just happened a few weeks ago. China has had collective political leadership for the course of, since the Deng Xiaoping era, the moving away from Maoist, cult of personality, etc. What does Xi Jinping just did? Xi Jinping just eliminated all opposition. Normally, you have the party congress, and they all come out. It's like a boy band. You get these guys, and it's like, here's the old Politburo members, here's the new Politburo members, and here's the new guy who's going to replace the current leader because he's term limited out after this. What do we see this time? There was no new guy. Everybody was somebody lower level or someone who's going to retire. Xi Jinping said, I'm not anointing a successor. I'm 55. I can stay here for years. And this is a big concern. The shift away possibly from China's traditional, very stable single-party rule system to a more personalist rule system would be another pattern, although China's party system is much more institutionalized and is much more successful.
Well, I'm going to close out with a question of my own, if I could, about the parallels, if there are any, between Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump. I mean, because I'm thinking about this personal leadership cult, if you will, or basis of authority, and also the nationalist slogans, Make America Great Again. What was the one from China?
Never forget national humiliation.
Never forget national humiliation, and then the Russian cultural defense of Russian culture and so forth. You've said before that American institutions will not allow the same sort of authoritarianism to develop. So I think that one of the concerns about the current American government is a shift toward authoritarianism. So can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. So the parallel essentially in terms of the rise of nationalism, of basically party-led or state-led nationalism, absolutely. We can see that across all three states. And this is when we talk about sort of the collapse of the post-Cold War liberal order, this is what everybody's talking about. It's basically a retreat into nationalism, and for the United States, a retreat into protectionism. Moving away from the global economy and so on and so forth. China, not so much doing that. China is still deeply export dependent. It desperately needs global markets. The Chinese population has saved 40 to 45% of their income. Domestic demand is not a thing that can basically keep that economy afloat. China needs a global trading system that operates and works well. Trump, conversely, has said, nope, we're moving out of it. Whether he actually does it is something to be seen, but so on and so forth. The other fun parallel, and we don't have the actual numbers, but everyone pretty much accepts, all three guys are billionaires. Xi Jinping is worth billions of dollars. Putin, there's various numbers running around. I've seen everything from $40 to $60 billion in terms of his actual net worth. And of course, Donald Trump made some bad investments and lost some of his dad's money, but is still in the billionaire range. In terms of the sort of shift to authoritarianism, this is something we're seeing globally. We talk about basically three phases of democratization, the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave in the 1990s. And today what we're seeing is basically a step backwards. We're seeing the move away from democracy where 10 or 15 years ago we were highly optimistic. So we can look at contemporary Thailand. I mean, democracy's done. I mean, we're basically looking at a military government. Cambodia is seeing the same thing, essentially Hun Sen's taking power in that country. The Philippines, 1980s, Corazon Aquino, huge success, the end of Marcos. You've got Duterte coming in talking about martial law. We're seeing a global rollback or global doubt in terms of whether or not democracy is feasible. In terms of the United States, I'm more optimistic because of simply the depth of, I mean, we traditionally call the countries like the U.S., Canada, consolidated democracies, where the feedback mechanisms for existing institutions are very, very strong. And it takes quite a bit to basically shift them. It takes a huge, basically, change in sort of popular will in terms of support base for it. The payoffs have to start changing. Now, the argument for the idea that the American system could change comes very much out of the idea that, well, look at these voters who voted for Trump. We're seeing this is the outcome of increasing economic stagnation in the United States, in certain parts of the country. The sort of the working class, blue collar vote is seeing stagnation in their wages. Their shift from the Democrats to the Republicans, but not the Mitt Romney Republican Party, but a very different Donald Trump, right populist, nationalist, and in many cases ethnic nationalist political party, which is something the U.S. hasn't historically seen, that this is a big shift. I'll be comfortable, I will stop sleeping nicely if I think the first thing we'll start to see is the next sort of canary in the coal mine is the 2018 midterm elections. So we logically should see a huge blowback. I mean, the standard is that the ruling party always basically loses, and they should lose 25 to 30 seats. If we didn't see that, then I'd start to get concerned. that there is something else going on that we don't know about, that there is this huge block of voters that have basically stuck with this particular individual and are continuing to support him, and it doesn't appear that the opposition party can retake control, or at least can't even win the basic historical minimum of taking these seats back. That for me would be sort of the first round. At the same time, there's the question of the U.S. judicial system has become so polarized. That's another concern, is what happens if Justice Kennedy passes away and so on and so forth. Where do we go from that? But for me, I look at American politics, and there's a wonderful paper by actually a former professor of mine at Emory, Alan Abramowitz. And Alan Abramowitz, brilliant scholar. And he basically he was the guy a year before the Trump election predicted basically where the American system was going. And he made the awesome conclusion that we've, as a society, have shifted away from the idea of positive partisanship, that we vote for a party or an individual because we want something, because that person represents the values or the policies or whatever is going to help me or improve my pocketbook or improve my job or improve my prospects or the prospects of my children. That's what we're going for. We've shifted in Abramowitz's view. Both parties have basically moved towards the edges. Democrats have become more to the left, Republicans have become more to the right. It's on both sides. And we're not voting in a positive way anymore. We're voting negatively. We're not voting for a candidate, we're voting against someone else. Or even worse, emotively speaking, we're voting to inflict pain on the other side. That's terrifying, because it means policy no longer has a feedback mechanism saying, oh, I'm voting for this and I get this. You don't care. If you prioritize hurting the other side, you don't necessarily care about the outcome for yourself, which means you can have institutional drift, benign neglect, huge weakness of institutions that could result in very scary change. But again, I'm waiting until November 2018 so I can sleep well.
Thank you very much.